The Plow That Broke the Plains, 1936, and The River, 1937, are both famous and influential American documentary films. Rather remarkably, these films were made by the federal government, which is to say they come from a time, the New Deal, the Depression, when the government was an important sponsor and funder of the arts. What most fascinates me about these two films is the synergistic relationship between the three ingredients: words, moving image, and music. All of them have equal weight, so the relationship between these three components is fascinating and unpredictable, and this is a very high achievement. It's very difficult to pull off. The words were written by Per Lorenz, who was also the director. The music was composed by Virgil Thomson, and the cinematographers included important figures in cinematography like Willard Van Dyke and Leo Horowitz, Ralph Steiner, Paul Strand. Some years ago, PostClassical Ensemble created a Naxos DVD featuring these two films with newly recorded soundtracks. And that made sense because obviously the original soundtracks are recorded in the 30s in binaural sound. And we added commentary by George Stoney, who in addition to being an important historian of documentary film and a documentary filmmaker himself, was an actual participant in the New Deal. The films are pertinent today for two reasons that I would say are blindingly obvious. We're in the midst of a global pandemic, And during this period, I think the arts will or should take on special importance. But secondly, the arts are financially challenged in new ways by the pandemic itself, and so it seems logical that the federal government should step in and play a new role, or at least an expanded role, in support of the arts. We just saw a sequence from The Plow That Broke the Plains, The Dust Storm. This is a movie that's about the Dust Bowl in the 30s, what caused it and what to do about it. And at the very end of this clip, we heard a harmonium, a pump organ playing Old Hundred, which is a hymn about divine bounty, the very thing that we do not see in this sequence any evidence of during this catastrophic Dust Bowl. And this ironic use of music is one of the features of these films which contradict Hollywood practice, something that we'll be talking about. They're the first films ever created by the federal government for commercial release. Before that, the government had made informational films, educational films. Neil Lerner, who we'll hear from in a moment, has said that they were the most widely publicized attempt by the federal government to communicate to its entire citizenry through a motion picture. We'll also hear from David Woolner, an important historian of the New Deal, and from Angel Gil-Ordóñez, who was the actual conductor on the DVD. These films are quintessential Americana. Willa Cather and Carl Sandburg were cited by Lawrence as inspirations. All the music by Thomson, Coles, American hymns, American popular songs. But at the same time, there's a Russian influence, an obvious influence exerted by Eisenstein, the great Soviet director, in the use of montage and visual metaphor.
What we just saw were a few seconds from Eisenstein's film Strike, and it gives us a quick example of the way Eisenstein, as a filmmaker, used the juxtaposition of several different shots, used it often with extremely loaded symbolic meaning. And what we have at that moment in the film we saw was a group of workers rising up in a strike, and Eisenstein intersperses those shots of the workers with shots of cattle being slaughtered. And so the idea is not that we're supposed to understand the story is a story about strikers and suddenly becomes a story about a slaughterhouse, but rather symbolically to understand that these workers in their strike are actually putting themselves into the position that cattle going into a slaughterhouse would be in. And this kind of dialectic, this kind of montage, this juxtaposition, it was something that the Soviet filmmakers were masterful at developing, something the Soviet filmmakers were pioneering. Actually, Eisenstein was himself influenced by someone like the U.S. director D.W. Griffith, and his use of montage as well. In that strike example, we see Eisenstein's counterpoint, and a similar kind of counterpoint in the editing ends up happening in The Plow That Broke the Plains, as Pere Lorentz most vividly and clearly has a series of scenes showing the overproduction of wheat in the Midwest of the U.S. during World War I, and his point is to try to link that wheat farming with the war effort. And so as we see the tractors moving out across the plains, Lorentz intersperses those shots with shots of tanks moving into the battlefield. And again, it's not that we're shifting a story around the world or to different stories and stuff. He's using that symbolically to drive home the idea that the farmers on their tractors were involved in the war effort just as the people driving the tanks into battle were. As Lorentz moves us between tractors, and tanks, Virgil Thomson wrote music that uses the World War I song Mademoiselle from Armentières, or Hinky Dinky Parlez-Vous. That melody, a melody that was popular during World War I, and that still would have been understood by an audience in 1936 as being a song related to World War I. Thomson uses this music to accompany this moment that is set back in World War I as well.
Wheat will win the war. Plant wheat. Plant the cattle ranges. Plant your vacant lots. Plant wheat. Wheat for the boys over there. Wheat for the Allies. Wheat for the British. Wheat for the Belgians. Wheat for the French. Wheat at any price. Wheat will win the war.
We're now going to see another clip from The Plow That Broke the Plains. This is the sequence that comes directly after what we just saw. Virgil Thomson uses a blues, a surprising choice for a sequence that, among other things, depicts the stock market crash in 1929. And after that, you'll notice how the parched earth of the Dust Bowl equates with the parched counterpoint of Thomson's score.
Then we reaped the golden harvest. Then we really plowed the plains. We turned under millions of new acres for war. We had the manpower. We invented new machinery. The world was our market. By 1933, the old grasslands had become the new wheatlands. 100 million acres, 200 million acres, more wheat. A country without rivers, without streams, with little rain. Once again the rains held off, and the sun baked the earth. This time no grass held moisture against the winds and sun. This time, millions of acres of plowed land lay open to the sun.
Virgil Thomson, like Aaron Copland, was unhappy about the way Hollywood used music. We're in 1936, so sound is relatively new in the movies. And Thomson and Copland have two complaints. The first is they think the Hollywood sound is too European. It's too upholstered. They want a cleaner, more American sound. And their second complaint is the deployment of music is too literal. They use the term Mickey Mousing, as used by Eric Korngold, to describe a literal relationship between the moving image and music. And this film breaks new ground in coming up with new strategies and a new sound for American film.
Earlier in the film, Thomson accompanied scenes of lush grasslands with a major mode, sort of very beautiful pastoral music, and he returned to that music in some of the scene we just saw with the scenes of drought. He returned to it, but he made the music much slower. He changed it from major to minor, and he orchestrated it slightly differently, and he does this juxtaposition in a similar way to the Soviet montage technique. Again, it's to build this dialectic, to show this two sides, this binary. in this case between the lush grassland in major and then the drought, barren land, which is in minor. Many parts visually of what goes on in this drought sequence appear to have been influenced by a 1934 Hollywood film that King Vidor directed called Our Daily Bread. And in this, a couple of city folk lose their money and decide to go and join up with a collective in the country and farm corn. And as happens sometimes in the Dust Bowl, they ran into bad weather and they were in risk of losing their crop. Now, when Hollywood wants to show what that drought scene looks like, it does it much more directly, I think, than happens even in Plow That Broke the Plains. We have the word drought appear on the screen. We have some of the same imagery of the bald car tire, the dog panting on the ground, later their footsteps walking through the sand, just footsteps showing a dejected person. And Lawrence really seems to have taken that same imagery, just down to the composition of each shot, the arrangement of the different things within the camera's frame. He imitates a lot of those. What is really strikingly different here is the music. So Our Daily Bread has music by Alfred Newman, and it's a really effective, good score in many ways, but it is in a European post-romantic style. And it's maybe a little more on the nose, a little more direct in some ways, compared to what Thomson will then do, which is using these much more basic musical elements of just minor triads. It ends up becoming much more dissonant than anything a Hollywood score would have done in 1936 as well.
Chris, what do you say?
Man, if this sun keeps up 3-4 days, that's all. Look, that corn is dying. I don't know what we're going to do.
Isn't there enough water in the well to do some good?
No.
But couldn't the men carry it from outside somewhere? The power company reservoir. How far is that?
3-4 miles. We couldn't carry enough in buckets or tanks to do any good.
But we have such a lot of people here. And a lot of cars.
The people are discouraged. Well, the money is just about all gone, and if we don't get rain, we won't have no crops. I heard some of the men say they was getting ready to leave.
Among the many differences between that clip, King Vidor directing, and the Plow That Broke the Plains, Pere Lorentz directing, obviously there's dialogue in Our Daily Bread, and there's no dialogue in these two films that we're talking about, The Plow That Broke the Plains and the River. That's partly because of a technical factor, that it was not easy to record sound in the field in 1936 and 1938. And this restriction, I would say, is turned into an aesthetic advantage. What you have for a very brief period of years is a unique cinematic template where you do have sound, you do have music, you do have words, but you have no spoken dialogue. That restriction gives these films a very special feel.
These films were made during the Great Depression, and of course, as most of us know, the United States was facing the worst economic crisis in its history when Franklin Roosevelt took office in the spring of 1933. Since the onset of the Great Depression in 1929, the volume of stock transactions in the stock exchange was down by over 60%. The gross national product was down by nearly 70%. And of course, unemployment was high 25% across the nation, but in cities like Detroit and Chicago, it was over 50%. The mayor of Chicago at one point said, you don't send relief, send in troops. There was actually a fear of possible revolution in the country. So this is the environment in which Roosevelt took office on the 4th of March, 1933, and the environment in which he famously told the American people, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
But it's interesting that the line that got the greatest applause in his first inaugural was actually a statement when he said, "This nation is calling for action and action now." And then Roosevelt, of course, swore in his cabinet on the same day all at once, and he launched this famous period in American history that we refer to as the 100 Days, time in which 15 major pieces of legislation were passed within the first 3 months that Congress was in session. So by the summer of 1933, Roosevelt was very concerned about unemployment continuing through the winter of 1933-34. This was going to be a very bitter, cold winter. And millions of people needed work and millions of people needed relief. And so as a means to try to provide that relief, Roosevelt decided to set up an institution called the Civil Works Administration, which would ultimately employ over 4 million people in the winter of 1933-34. And while he was contemplating this idea, a friend of his named George Biddle wrote him a letter in May of 33, suggesting that Roosevelt might want to hire artists to adorn public buildings. Biddle had been very inspired by the Mexican muralists who adorned buildings in Mexico in the 1920s and thought that these artists could do the same thing in the United States, and that they would not only enhance the buildings themselves, but also could deliver this message of the great social ideals that the New Deal espoused and that Roosevelt was trying to promote. Roosevelt responded quite positively to this. He knew that there might be some criticism of this idea, but on balance, he thought it was a good idea. And by December of 1933, they had established what was called the Public Works Art Project, which ended up employing over 3,000 artists in that difficult winter of 1933-1934. So the Public Works Art Project only lasted for 6 months. Quite extraordinary, produced thousands of works of art and some very famous works, including the Coit Tower murals in San Francisco, and employed some very important artists. But it came to an end, and Roosevelt was right in assuming that there'd be a good deal of criticism of the government getting involved in hiring artists. But inspired by Harry Hopkins and Eleanor Roosevelt and others, he was convinced that they should renew the program. And by the middle of the 1930s, when we get to 1935, Roosevelt decided to launch what was called the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, famous work program that ran from 1935 to 1943 and employed over 8.3 million Americans during that time. The WPA was absolutely extraordinary. It built over almost 600,000 miles of roads, 122,000 bridges, 60,000 miles of public streets, thousands of miles of waterways. It really built the infrastructure of America. And when it was being set up, Harry Hopkins famously said that artists had to eat too, and he wanted to, in a sense, return to this public arts project that he had been involved with through the CWA. And Roosevelt agreed, and they set up what was called the Federal One Project, the WPA Federal Arts Project, which would last for most of the period that the WPA was in existence. Those that promoted the WPA arts projects believed that art was valuable in its own right, and it was extraordinarily successful. They produced over 2,500 murals, over 100,000 paintings, thousands of sculptures, and provided community art centers and set up teaching programs and supported over 34 community orchestras. It really was an extraordinary level of support. But part of the reason that Roosevelt wanted to promote the arts was because he really associated the promotion of art, public art, with the promotion of democracy. Roosevelt and the Roosevelt administration really believed that art should belong to the people. He believed that art and democracy were intimately linked. In dedicating the opening of the new Museum of Modern Art in New York City in 1939, he equated freedom, political freedom, with artistic freedom, and said you can't have free art unless you have a political system that supports political freedom. So for Roosevelt and for those in the New Deal, the New Dealers, this was also about not just promoting culture, but promoting democracy.
For we know that only where men are free can the arts flourish and the civilization of national culture reach full flower. The arts cannot thrive except where men are free to be themselves and to be in charge of the discipline of their own energies and their own ardors. The conditions for democracy and for art are one and the same. What you and I call liberty in politics results in the long run in freedom in the arts.
So one of the ways that Roosevelt communicated, of course, with the public was through the use of what he called his Fireside Chats, these famous 20-minute or so talks where he would explain what the government was doing to try to alleviate the crisis that we know as the Great Depression. But another means that he could use to try to communicate with the American people was through films like the Père Lorenz film projects that we're seeing here today, through the Plow that Broke the Plains, and of course through the film The River. You know, one of the things that we tend to forget is that we have both an environmental catastrophe and an economic catastrophe going on here at the same time. So in this sense, I think the Plow in particular, but also The River, is very effective at portraying the devastation that came about as a result of the overcultivation of the Midwest, for example. And one of the ways, of course, that Roosevelt dealt with that was to plant 218 million trees from the Texas border all the way to the Canadian border, over 18,000 miles of shelter belts. So in trying to communicate this important aspect of the New Deal, the economic benefits, the environmental benefits, and so forth, people like George Stoney would go out into communities, show these films, and then try to convince people in these local communities that the New Deal was not only important, but worth supporting.
I think I first saw The River in 1939, and then when in 1940, when I became the Farm Securities press officer for the Southeast, I started using it as a principal propaganda device. I showed it over 100 times, and I showed it in small towns, I showed it in high schools, I showed it all over the place, and it always worked. And I kept wondering why, because it's a very serious film. Then I realized that it took the form of an evangelical sermon. We have Eden, and then man sins, and then we know what we did, and we repent, and then we have salvation. We're on to heaven and the TVA. And emotionally, it worked so well that I could say to that audience, okay, now, you've seen the film. It illustrates the problems we have. And in this county, we have, say, 318 clients who work for the who are on the Farm Securities rolls. Some of them are actually getting grants. And the heads would nod because I was talking to the Rotary Club, and they were knowing that those people they looked down on, the poor whites and as well as the blacks, were getting government handouts, they thought. And I would say, well, we spent a couple of $1 million in this county. But where do you think that money was spent? It was in your drugstore. It was in your feed store. It was paid the doctor's bill. That's you benefiting from that too.
So the film actually converted people to the New Deal.
Well, we were trying to get them to support the New Deal and its various measures. And I think that it was effective in doing so.
We come now to the second of these two remarkable Père Lorenz films, The River, This is a film that won the award as the best documentary film at the 1938 Venice Film Festival, beating Leni Riefenstahl's Olympiad. This is a film, the script of which was praised by James Joyce as the most beautiful prose he had heard in 10 years, a film that was actually distributed by Paramount Pictures.
What I think is absolutely crucial in the music of these films is actually the structure of the narration, which beautifully George Stoney described. The idea of these documentaries are sermons. So we were living in balance with nature, we destroyed nature, and then now the government has the solution. I think that's this kind of simple approach in narration is crucial to understand why Thomson wrote the way he wrote, using tunes and hymns that the audience would recognize immediately. So the narration, which is actually, it relates a lot to Walt Whitman. People have referred about this narration, this American Whitman-esque approach of the narration, of simplicity and nature is crucial in my opinion. So for the river, the hymn that he uses in the opening scene is a very famous and recognizable hymn at the time, which is called Resignation.
From as far west as Idaho, down from the glacier peaks of the Rockies, from as far east as Pennsylvania, down from the turnkey ridges of the Alleghenies, down from Minnesota, 2,500 miles, the Mississippi River runs to the Gulf, carrying every drop of water that flows down 2/3 the continent, carrying every brook and rill, rivulet and creek, carrying all the rivers that run down 2/3 the continent, the Mississippi runs to the Gulf of Mexico. Down the Yellowstone, the Milk, the White and Cheyenne, the Cannonball, the Musselshell, the James and the Sioux, down the Judith, the Grand, the Osage and the Platte, the Skunk, the Salt, the Black and Minnesota, down the Rock, the Illinois and the Kankakee, the Allegheny, the Monongahela, Kanawha and Muskegum, down the Miami, the Wabash, the Licking and the Green, the Cumberland, the Kentucky and the Tennessee, down the Washita, the Wichita, the Red and Yazoo, down the Missouri, 3,000 miles from the Rockies, down the Ohio, 1,000 miles from the Alleghenies, down the Arkansas, 1,500 miles from the Great Divide, down the Red, 1,000 miles from Texas, down the Great Valley, 2,500 miles from Minnesota, carrying every rivulet and brook, creek and rill, carrying all the rivers that run down 2/3 the continent, the Mississippi runs to the Gulf.
We start the film with this beautiful hymn showing how the river is the birth of the river, how the river grows into in the climax is this beautiful resignation hymn. And as a beautiful contraposition of that, as a big contrast, the other most dramatic scene of the documentary is the flirting scene, which actually is a parallel, a dramatic parallel. So how rain starts and how the flooding starts. And for that incredible dramatic part, he uses another famous hymn, which is called Mississippi, which actually it refers to the apocalypse. I'm going to read you one of the sentences of the hymn. All around the clouds are breaking. Soon the storms of time shall cease. So there is hope there, but it's showing that. And actually, of course, the Mississippi hymn is there. And then he uses a beautifully just very simple homophony at the beginning, and then he creates this beautiful canon, almost fugue, which is another very interesting characteristic of the Thomson in the documentaries, which he uses fugues all the time, which should be, for Hollywood films is forbidden completely. I mean, how can you use a fugue in a Hollywood film? So I think this is really fascinating.
For the water comes downhill, spring and fall, down from the cut-over mountains, down from the plowed-off slopes, from as far west as Idaho, from as far east as Pennsylvania, down every brook and rill, rivulet and creek, carrying every drop of water that flows down 2/3 the continent. 1903, 1907, 1913, 1916, 1922, 1927, 1936, 1937. Down from Pennsylvania and Ohio, Kentucky and West Virginia, Missouri and Illinois, down from North Carolina and Tennessee, down the Judith, the Grand, the Osage and the Platte, the Rock, the Salt, the Black and Minnesota, down the Monongahela, the Allegheny, Kanawha and Muskingum, the Miami, the Wabash, the Licking and the Green, the White, the Wolf, and the Cache and the Black, down the Kaw and Kaskaskia, the Red and Yazoo, down the Cumberland, Kentucky, and the Tennessee, down the Ohio, 1,000 miles from Pittsburgh, down the Arkansas, 1,000 miles from Texas, down to the Mississippi. New Orleans to Baton Rouge to Natchez, Natchez to Vicksburg, Vicksburg to Memphis, Memphis to Cairo. 1,000 miles down the levee the long vigil starts. 38 feet at Baton Rouge, river rising. Helena, river rising. Memphis, river rising. Cairo, river rising. 1,000 miles to go, 1,000 miles of levee to hold. Coast Guard Patrol needed at Paducah. Coast Guard Patrol needed at Paducah. 200 boats wanted at Hickman. 200 boats wanted at Hickman. Levee Patrol, men to Blytheville. Levy patrol, men to Blytheville.
After the success of the two films, The Plow That Broke the Plains and The River, Pertinence was able to establish the U.S. Film Service, which existed for 2 years. It ended up producing one more film, The Fight for Life. Lorentz planned several other film projects that were never completed, and he completed one radio drama, Ecce Homo. But the combined forces of politics as well as opposition from the film industry, which didn't want to be in competition with the government, ended up shutting down the U.S. Film Service in 1940.
One of the interesting things to contemplate is whether or not the New Deal support for the arts might have continued had there not been a Second World War. It's an interesting thing to contemplate. And even with the war, it's also interesting to contemplate. And Roosevelt firmly believed that art enriched life, and he was interested always in trying to enrich the life of the American people. And in some ways, he treated art like he treated religion. In his famous Four Freedoms address, he talked about the freedom of every person to worship God in his own way. And I think he didn't promote any particular religion, but I think he felt that a sense of faith, a sense of spirituality was important to a full life. And I think the same could be said for art. So as Roosevelt as the end of the war was approaching, and Roosevelt actually was approaching the end of his life, he was very concerned about what was going to happen after the war. And he was very concerned about a return of high unemployment. And he actually reconstituted a commission to look into the possibility of a guaranteed annual wage. And under these circumstances, I think it's conceivable that some form of public support for the arts might have continued. As I said, he believed art really enriched life, and he believed in promoting what he called cultural democracy, this idea that art should be accessible to all people, which is one of the great goals of the federal arts projects.
We come now to the elephant in the room, which is race. And here we have a film, The River, produced by the New Deal, in which, without any commentary, we see African-American slaves in the field, black field workers rolling bales of cotton. And Lorentz purposely includes Robert E. Lee's speech of surrender as a means of ingratiating himself to Southern audiences. And indeed, it's known that when this film, The River, was screened in the South, many in the audience would stand when they saw the words of Robert E. Lee. Also, Lorentz instructed Thomson that he wanted to hear music in the style of minstrelsy, and the log rolling sequence in The River, where the music is a hot time in the old town tonight, is scored with banjo in a minstrel style. Roosevelt, in addition to being an activist president, was a consummate politician. We heard George Stoney talk about how the New Deal looked after poor whites and poor blacks in the South. But as is well known, the New Deal also had to make, or chose to make, a kind of devil's pact with segregation. In order to retain his Democratic base in the South, Roosevelt did not challenge Jim Crow.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. Give me your help not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
The New Deal was challenged in the latter part of Roosevelt's administration before the Second World War by politicians who were comfortably in their Democratic seats because of Roosevelt. And but I don't think our overall policies were challenged too much, because it was an understanding that we were somehow preserving the the class structure. You see, we never challenged race. Ours was just as segregated as any other government program. We did have a few places where there were consolidated farms. I think they were called test farms, where there were either groups of blacks or groups of whites who were on what was really a kind of farm security plantation. I recall vividly one that was near Tuskegee, and I wanted to do a story about it for the local newspapers. So I went over and I met the young man who was in charge. Now, he was one of the very few college-bred black people employed by the Farm Security Administration, and he was in charge of this farm. Well, there I was, just right out of college myself. There he was, just out of college himself. He was surrounded by illiterate or almost illiterate black people. And he was lonely, and I was lonely. And we had a couple of nights talking, and it was just wonderful. Well, you see, we could share meals and so forth because we weren't being watched by anybody. I went back to my office in Montgomery, which is just 40 miles away. And a couple of weeks later, I was going into the post office, out the front steps, up going into the door, and he came down. And I said, "Oh, Larry," and our hands touched, handshake. Well, that was a clear violation of the racial code at the time. And I could still feel his hand. We didn't want to pull our hands away from one another, and yet we knew we should. Well, 20 years later, I was working at New York University, where I now teach, and he showed up. I hadn't been in touch with him before. He recognized my name. He brought a young relative to see if he could help her get accepted at NYU. And he reminded me of who he was, and I told her this story. And I told her that when I got back to my regional office, there was a call from my director, the head of the regional. He said, "George, you should know better than to do that. We have enough trouble with politics around here, with people accusing us of being nigger lovers. Why do you do that?" Well, he said, "George, let me tell you my side of it. When I got back to my state office, I was told, 'You son of a bitch, you better watch yourself. You're going to get yourself lynched.'"
So this is the context in which the river was shown in the South as propaganda, as an attempt to reconcile these voting whites to the expenditure of federal funds for disenfranchised blacks. Do you think it was an effective tool in achieving that purpose?
I don't think that race entered into it. You remember that certainly not in my conversations. We never crossed the race line in my conversations with people, and the film itself never challenges race. Remember, in the narration it says the planters brought their plows and their blacks and their mules over the river into the new farmlands. Remember that the tribute to Robert E. Lee, which was in a good part an attempt to win the support of the Southerners. There is no mention of race in either the Plow or the Plow that Broke the Plains, or the river.
And one reads that when the film was shown first in the South, the audience would stand when these words were projected on the screen.
I've heard that audiences did stand and salute the stars and bars at the time. And I wouldn't be surprised, because certainly at that time, in the late 30s and early 40s, there was that kind of feeling of patriotism.
So we look at this film, George Stoney has already talked about this, and we witness the devil's pact that the New Deal made with race. Roosevelt was not going to challenge race because of his solid democratic Southern base. So what we're looking at is one in a series of compromises, beginning with compromises that were written into the United States Constitution. And all of us are scratching our heads now and looking back at American history and asking, at what point might the compromises have stopped, or should they have stopped?
One of the great challenges facing Roosevelt during the New Deal was the question of race. We shouldn't forget that the strongest opponents to the New Deal were Southern Democrats who didn't like Roosevelt, didn't like the New Deal, and made it very difficult for Roosevelt to take the issue of race head on in the political landscape in which he was trying to operate. There's much that we can say about the New Deal that was positive, of course, for the African American community. 15% of all the workers in the WPA were African American. Large numbers of African American youth received support from the National Youth Administration. And Mary McLeod Bethune said that it was the first time in American history that the African American community felt they could look to the federal government and receive their concerns with a sympathetic ear. And yet still, racism continues, and the Jim Crow South continued. And as I said, Roosevelt really felt it was something that he couldn't take on with these powerful House leaders coming from the South. So when we think back on the issue of race, and we think back on the film and its kind of endorsement as almost really a tacit endorsement of the racism that existed, particularly in the Southern United States, it brings back to mind this great tragedy that goes all the way back to the American Constitution, this idea that African Americans only constituted 3/5 of a citizen, this idea that America was founded on slavery, and the terrible, terrible violence that was meted out against the African American community over the years and centuries through lynching and so forth. We have to ask ourselves, when is enough enough, and when is it that leaders really have to step up and stand up to these racist forces? Of course, we shouldn't forget that the president who ultimately did it was Lyndon Johnson, who considered himself a child of FDR, very much a child of the New Deal. And it's Johnson who finally made the determination that he was going to pass the Civil Rights Act, which essentially jettisoned the South and made this dramatic shift in Southern politics during the 60s and 70s, away from the Democratic Party and over to the Republican Party, which is interesting when you think about it, because, of course, it's during the 1930s that the vast majority of African Americans shifted their vote from the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, to the party of Roosevelt in 1936.
My fellow Americans, I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Its purpose is national, not regional. Its purpose is to promote a more abiding commitment to freedom, a more constant pursuit of justice, and a deeper respect for human dignity.
It's a mixed story when we're talking about Roosevelt and the New Deal. Certainly, much of it was going in the right direction. But again, how much patience can a nation have with this terrible, terrible issue? In the wake of the killing of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, one has to wonder if today's leaders will have the courage to stare down the racism that has been such an endemic and a tragic part of our history.
We're going to close with my favorite sequence from either of these films. It's also the most inscrutable sequence. It is the ending of The Plow That Broke the Plains, where we see a parade of sad cars fleeing the Dust Bowl, and Thomson composes a tango. Why there's a tango here, nobody knows, but it's memorable and it's fresh. The only thing I can add is that Thomson liked tangos.
From an early point in his work on this film score, Virgil Thomson referred to the music he wrote for the end as a tango. He called it a tango over and over. He had written tangos earlier in his career. In his Sonata da Chiesa, his sort of graduation piece, as he called it, from working with Nadia Boulanger, he included a tango. He would play with this idea of tango in other works. And so we know he liked the idea of a tango, even if it's not actually a tango. And still, after a couple of decades of looking at this film and trying to figure out what that tango is doing there, it's still a bit of a mystery to me. One thing might be that he was looking at the idea of the Dust Bowl inhabitants moving to the southwest and tried to give it more of a regional character that way. But I'm myself not completely persuaded that that's why. It's still just a sort of fantastic and mysterious moment at the end of this film.
Yes, it is a mystery to me, the ending of the Plow that broke the plains. The ending music is meant to be a tango. To me, it sounds like an habanera. But the important thing is how geniusly he takes the theme from the beginning, which is this beautiful fugue, that actually, you know, it's a leitmotif that is repeated along the documentary, but how he takes that theme and makes it very, very slow and creates this dramatic and this really enigmatic ending, slowing down completely the tempo. Pam 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 tarim pam 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 pam.
On to the west. Once again they headed into the setting sun. Once again, they headed west. Last year, in every summer month, 50,000 people left the Great Plains and hit the highways for the Pacific coast, the last border. Blown out, baked out, and broke. Nothing to stay for, nothing to hope for. Homeless, penniless, and bewildered, they joined the great army of the highways. No place to go, and no place to stop. Nothing to eat, nothing to do. Their homes on four wheels. Their work the desperate gamble for a day's labor in the fields along the highways. The price of a sack of beans or a tank of gas. All they ask is a chance to start over. And a chance for their children to eat, to have medical care, to have homes again. 50,000 a month. The sun and winds wrote the most tragic chapter in American agriculture.